Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Chairperson, fellow panelists, friends, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Salam Sujatra, peace be with you. Let me begin by thanking the organizers, Asia We, and the Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies, University of Tehran, for this very kind invitation. My topic is in the form of a question. Before one attempts to answer this question, let me begin by saying that, by and large, followers of different religions in most parts of the world have been able to coexist peacefully. This is true even of societies where you have eruptions, where you have friction and perhaps sometimes bloody conflicts. But once the conflict is over, you find that people are able to live peacefully. This is true of countries like the United States or France or India, Indonesia. There are examples to support this, that they do continue to live peacefully in spite of occasional eruptions, occasional moments of tension, friction, and conflict. Nonetheless, we have to try to explain why sometimes, perhaps increasingly so, followers of different religions are not able to coexist. Why does this happen? I do not think it is wise to try to explain this through a generalized, there's a danger in this, because if you generalize, you'll find that your conclusions may not fit particular situations. And in the case of ethnicity in particular, ethnic relations, generalization is dangerous. Because very often ethnic conflicts are contextual. And the contextual dimension is very, very important, which is why I will not try to generalize on the reasons why sometimes followers of different religions are not able to relate to one another. What I'll do is look at certain situations, try to draw some conclusions from these specific situations, and then perhaps conclude by looking at possible solutions to the challenges that we face. I shall look at 6 situations very quickly, very briefly, very quickly, of societies where there are tensions and there is conflict amongst some followers of a particular religion and followers of another religion. Let me begin with Myanmar, because that's very much in the news and it's our part of the world. You have the problem of Buddhists and Muslims in Rakhine, one of the provinces in Myanmar, and you have a certain degree of tension between the majority Buddhist community, the Burman Buddhists, and minorities, some Buddhist, some Christian, Shans, Karens, Kachins, Chins. This is something that we must keep in mind, because sometimes we are under the impression that it is only the problem in Rohingya, involving the Rohingyas, that is serious. This is not true. There have been longer periods of conflict between the majority Burman Buddhists and some of the other minorities in Myanmar. Why is this happening? one could argue that this has something to do with a variety of factors. If you look at the Rohingya and the Rakhine province, one can argue that perhaps one of the reasons is because this province, Rakhine, originally known as Arakan, was annexed by the Buddhist majority, the Buddhist kingdom at that time. And it is because of annexation that there has been a great deal of resentment. An inability to adjust to one another, one of the reasons why there's tension and friction. And this has happened at other times. There have been instances where they had clashed before, meaning by which before 1962 it had also happened. And it is related in some respects to annexation. We should keep this in mind, because you'll find that this very important factor, annexation, and drawing in a province or a people into a certain setting as a result of annexation, seems to be a factor in a number of cases. In the case of Thailand, the Patani kingdom was also annexed. In the case of Arakan, it was in 1785. If you look at Xinjiang in China, it was also annexed, 1949. Even before that, tensions, conflicts, and then annexation. Annexation appears to be a factor that contributes to unstable relations, a product of annexation. And we have to try to understand this, because you're bringing in a different province, a land, a culture, a community, very often a different religion. In the case of all the three examples I cited just now, and I'd be talking about one of them in a while, you will find that in the case of the Rakhine province and the Rohingya people, in the case of the Malays of southern Thailand, centered around Patani initially, and in the case of Myanmar, and of course, the case of Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, there is also a physiological dimension. All of them are different from the majority, physically, in terms of their origin and their evolution as a people. So that may have also contributed to it. So these are factors that we may want to keep in mind that lead to a situation where stable relations becomes a challenge. Then there is undoubtedly the point about dominance and control, the tendency of elements within the majority community to want to dominate the minorities. It's true of Myanmar, which is why there's been this uneasy relationship between the Burman Buddhist majority and Christians, Muslims, and so on. Dominate, control, impose your will upon the minority. Now, what has made the Myanmar situation particularly lethal, particularly toxic, is the forces which are driving this move towards dominance and control. In the case of Myanmar, it is the military working hand in glove with religious elites. And that is a lethal combination, military and religious elites working together. That's what has made it much worse than in many other places, the military and the religious elites. Very quickly, if you look at China, again, the annexation factor that I alluded to earlier, also the factor about dominance, majority community, and in the case of China and Xinjiang, something, again, we see in a couple of other places, you have this attempt to dilute a community associated with a particular region. In other words, you bring in people from the majority community, you flood this province until that community becomes a minority. The original community there becomes a minority. This has happened in the case of the Philippines vis-a-vis southern Philippines, Mindanao in particular. It has happened in the case of Thailand to some extent, historically. And it has certainly happened in the case of Xinjiang, where the Han migration, deliberately organized by the state on a massive scale, had diluted the population, where the Uyghur, who were actually the community associated with that area, also known as West Turkestan, they had become a minority. That's the situation today. So this has contributed to it. And as a reaction to this, largely this policy of dilution, you find that a separatist movement had developed in Xinjiang. It has been there for more than 20 years, actually, the separatist movement. And some elements had resorted to violence out of their frustration. In the last 10 years or so, they have linked up with Al-Qaeda, some elements who are part of the separatist movement, basically Uyghurs. And as a result of what had happened in Syria and Iraq, the civil war in Syria, you find that a lot of Uyghurs had gone there. And once the civil war was over, and the militants who had tried to defeat the government of Bashar al-Assad, they had failed, a number of them had returned. And this is why the situation has taken a turn for the worse in Xinjiang today, because those who have returned, they have given a fresh impetus to insurgency. And the insurgency that had died down has now suddenly become serious. And as a result of that, the Chinese have organized re-education centers and all the rest of it because of their fear of this renewed insurgency. So, relationship between the Han Chinese, the Uyghurs, the dominant Beijing-centered government, and this province, especially the minority in that province now, the Uyghurs, now this has become a matter of grave concern. Look at yet another country, India, the third example. India, partly because of their conception of what the nation should be. This is, in some ways, the root of the problem in India. For the Indians, a segment of the Hindus, more so now than in the past, their notion of the state revolves around Hinduism. The history of the land, about the Hindu identity and all the rest of it. It was not as strong in 1947 as it is now within the elite, this notion of what India is, Hindutva, the whole idea of Hindutva, associated at one time with marginal groups. Today it has become less marginal. I wouldn't dare say it is mainstream, but it's certainly less marginal. That sort of thinking, Hindutva connected with the government in New Delhi. Hindu chauvinism, to put it very crudely, that is what is happening. It has emerged as something very powerful. And a reaction to that, of course, among the Muslims, right from the beginning, the notion of the nation state itself, the Muslims or a segment of them had a different idea, which is what led to Pakistan, the birth of Pakistan. But since then, you find that Hindu-Muslim tensions have broken out from time to time, and amongst Muslims, a sort of ghettoish psychology has developed, partly a reaction to the environment, a ghettoish psychology, becoming more insular, more exclusive in the outlook. A fourth example, very quickly, Palestine. Palestine, a slightly different story. It is occupation, annexation, expulsion of the indigenous people, the way many of them had been killed as a result of Israeli occupation. started immediately after the Balfour Declaration of 1917, intensified after the Holocaust, became a reality in the form of the Israeli state in 1948, that epitomized the marginalization of the Palestinian people. And it's accompanied by an ideology, the Zionist ideology, which drives this. The ideology of expansionism, of control, of dominance, and the Muslim reaction, and that reaction, a militant dimension to it, apart from those who protest peacefully, that has been there right from the beginning, except the one that has always dominated the news has been the militant dimension of that protest, which is unfortunate. But there is that militant dimension that has made the situation worse. It has exacerbated ties between the Israelis and the Palestinians, Jews and Muslims, and of course the Christians. Don't forget, the Christians are very much a part of the Palestinian reality. At one time it was more significant numerically. Today the Christian community has diminished, partly because of the chaos and the tumult that is taking place in Palestine. Let me look at yet another example very quickly. France. France, where there have been tensions between segments of the majority and the minority is a minority, largely Muslim, that has been there for quite a long while. As you know, the Muslim population in France is, in statistical terms, the largest in Europe. And they are from North Africa mainly. Many of them are poor. Employment has been a problem for groups of them over a period of time. Lack of social mobility. So there is a socio-economic dimension that has aggravated their situation of the Muslim minority. And to add to that is, of course, the psychology associated with a segment of Europe for a very long while, Islamophobia, the fear of Islam. It's a long history. It's not something that started after the war on terror. It has been there for hundreds of years. In fact, Karen Armstrong argues that it is more than 1,000 years old, Islamophobia, this fear of Islam, to such an extent that when the European princes were conducting the Crusades and slaughtering people in the thousands in the Crusades, not just Muslims, mind you, but also Jews. In fact, more Jews died in the slaughters that took place in that area, Palestine and surrounding areas, than Muslims. They also slaughtered other Christians, the Byzantine Christians, Eastern Christians were also slaughtered by the Crusaders from the West in the name of Christianity, though there was nothing Christian about what they were doing. But if you look at that phenomenon, this notion of violence, as Karen Armstrong argues, was transferred to the Muslims, when actually it was the Crusaders who had committed massive violence, horrendous violence at that time. So Islamophobia, with a certain view of what Muslims are, what Islam is, it has been there for a long while. It has become much worse in recent years in parts of Europe, including France, because of migration. And the migration, again, and this is the irony of it, a lot of it is due to the turmoil in countries which have been conquered by, or where manipulation has taken place as a result of what some of the Western powers have done. So you create chaos in Libya, you create chaos in Syria, you create chaos in other countries. People migrate, they cross the seas, they cross the Mediterranean, they go to Europe, and that becomes a problem. And that intensifies, reinforces Islamophobia. So that's another phenomenon. The United States of America, it never really had Islamophobia for a long, long while, actually, except that now it has become a phenomenon of sorts in the United States of America. But generally, the US, the dominant WASP population, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant population, as against the minorities, that has been a challenge for a long while. At one time, it was not just the non-whites, the African-American population, background in slavery and oppression, persecution. We're very much aware of that. But even a segment of the white population, like Catholics, they were also discriminated, which is why this is known as a WASP phenomenon, because the Catholics were also victims of this at one point in history. But now, of course, things have changed. Nonetheless, against the black population, you find that you still have eruptions, friction from time to time, and also actual killings. And it has been made worse in the United States of America against the black population, against Muslims, because of a white supremacist ideology that has developed over time, but reinforced undoubtedly through Trump's presidency. So Trump and his presidency, it has contributed to this phenomenon. Friends, if you look at these 6 examples, you'll find that the situations are different. There are similarities, there are parallels, but nonetheless, each situation warrants its own analysis. And that would be true of many other countries in the world, including our own country, Malaysia. If you're looking at ethnic relations, you can't just apply some model that you have from somewhere else to Malaysia to look at our own situation. But the point one wants to make is this, that you'll have to work out solutions that make sense within each setting. Like in the case of Islamophobia, you have to combat Islamophobia intellectually. You have to combat Islamophobia through interaction, through a better understanding of each other. All these things would be important, but also socioeconomic measures, social mobility, jobs, all these things would count in trying to change situations like this. If you're dealing with a situation like Myanmar, something very specific, citizenship rights for the Rohingyas, that would be a great help. But also, I think, somehow trying to convince the majority community that this notion of dominance, of a sort of a chauvinism associated with their position, Burman Buddhist majority, it is not doing justice to Myanmar at all. And how does one do this? I suppose it's a question of education, but also socioeconomic measures that have to be taken, and perhaps pressure from neighbors, international law, regional initiatives. All these things would be among the measures that one can take. Within religion itself, yes, religion can also play a role. There's no doubt at all that we have to educate people, raise the awareness about the differences and similarities, not just the similarities, mind you, the differences among religions. That's important. Appreciation of differences will contribute to greater harmony when you really understand what these differences are. But at the same time, the shared values. On a whole variety of issues, it is just amazing how much different religious communities actually share in terms of their attitudes towards environment, family, leadership, an ethical economy, towards diversity. There's tremendous similarity. There's a great deal that we share. And these shared values and principles should be emphasized all the while, over and over again. That is very important. And I want to conclude, friends, by saying that over and above shared values and principles amongst the different religions, which we have talked about and which we will continue to talk about for a very long while, I think it is so important for us to realize that there is such a thing as an essential humanity, a humanity that is essential to all of us as human beings. It is something which we need to emphasize much more today than ever before, partly because of the way in which the world is changing, globalization and the forces of globalization, but also because of what science has discovered. If you look at recent genetic studies, it is so obvious that the genetic factors that bind us together are overwhelmingly powerful. The differences between people who seem to be different are so insignificant, so infinitesimal, that you can even ignore them. The similarities are really overwhelmingly convincing. And this is what I think we should focus upon. And in terms of what social science tells us about values, principles, about how human beings react, attitudes, behavioral patterns, all these things tell us that we should not just be trapped in our differences, even though we acknowledge differences and understand differences. This is what I mean by our essential humanity. And that essential humanity should convince us that over and above every other form of identity, including our religious identity, is our human identity, is our human identity. We cannot emphasize this enough. Because we live in an age, partly because of the changes that are taking place, where people have become more conscious of identity. But identity expressed in terms of ethnicity, religion, in terms of nationality in some cases, make America great, make China great, that sort of a thing. These are all identities. So there is an obsession with identity. But the point one wants to make, and this is, I hope, the message that one would succeed in getting across, that over and above all these identities is our common human identity. If we are talking about the divine, and in programs like this, organized by groups like this, the question of the divine, of God, is something which is there in the foreground and in the background. If you're talking of God, the only identity that God is responsible for is our human identity. God is not responsible for our religious identity. He's not responsible for our cultural identity. He's not responsible for our national identity. He's not responsible for any of the other identities. The only identity, as far as this discussion about identity and identity politics goes, the only identity that God is responsible for is our human identity. And that is the identity which we should return to. We have to return to that identity, that we are human beings first and last. Over and above everything else, we are human beings, and that must mean something, not just a slogan. It must mean something in terms of the way we live, how we relate to one another, how we exist and flourish. Thank you.